Yeah. So good afternoon, students. Welcome back. Let us resume our discussion on I. Richards, the English critic who contributed much to the field of literary criticism in the 20th century. He was one of the first critics to bring a spirit of a scientific spirit into the act of literary criticism. As he rightly pointed out in many of his works, literary criticism till that point of time was largely a very personal, sometimes informal, and largely biased kind of activity based on one's own impressions and one's own, desires and wishes and so on. It was to take it away from that kind of prejudiced and personal background that people like I. Richards tried. So he ushered in the very concept and practice of practical criticism, where the act of literary criticism was done in a more practical manner without getting swayed by emotions or personal likes and dislikes. So it has to be done with reason, with logic, and in a more or less scientific manner. That was his argument. So it is this a new trend in literary criticism that was introduced by people like I. Richards that we need to discuss. We've already seen the work of another critic who also argued along the same lines, and that is T.S. Eliot, who in all his essays conveyed this, about looking at a literary work through a different angle altogether. The need to do that, do it that way. And this was precisely the task taken up by I. Richards too, and he practiced it to perfection in his own classes, where he enabled the students to do practical criticism by distributing leaflets that bore no name of the poet or the age in which the work was written, and thereby convincing everyone that you can do literary criticism without having any information at all about the poet or the personality of the writer or any such additional information. So that was his practical pedagogy or his practical criticism. And the way in which I. Richards's kind of literary criticism went on to influence whole new schools of literary criticism, like the new criticism in America. That is something that cannot be overemphasized. So the new critics owe much to I. Richards, the British critic who made practical criticism very popular. So to go back to I. Richards's literary criticism and the four major concepts that we have to discuss, allow me to make the presentation. Yeah. So the four topics that we are expected to discuss are poetry and communication, practical criticism, four kinds of meaning, and the scientific and emotive use of language. We already had a discussion in the previous class. We got introduced to Ivor Armstrong Richards, the English critic, poet, and teacher. The list of major works like Practical Criticism, Principles of Literary Criticism, The Meaning of Meaning, and so on. Some of which, of course, he wrote in collaboration with other critics like C.K. Ogden. Shivani K.M. Is she a student of this class? Shivani. Chandana or Nandana can tell me.
No, ma'am.
Yeah. Nandana BN.
Yes, ma'am. നമ്മളെ ക്ലാസ്സാ.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the first critics to bring that scientific precision and objectivity into literary criticism. He, along with T.S. Eliot, swayed the way that literary criticism was practiced. We discussed his method of experimental pedagogy in the previous class, whereby he could advance the practice of the close reading of literature. That is what he called practical criticism. Yeah, so moving on from practical criticism, from the act of, doing literary criticism in a very practical manner, let us discuss some of the important topics that came up in his works. And one question that he repeatedly asked in all his works is, what kind of activity is poetry? Poetry was not considered simply as a product of the writer's inspired moment, as critics like Wordsworth would have done during the Romantic age. They considered poetry to be the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions and feelings and so on. But here, they're looking at poetry through a very practical angle, and they are more interested in looking at the whole activity, the whole activity that goes into the composition of the poem. So what kind of activity is poetry? And more importantly, or equally importantly, what is the value of poetry in an age when you have, scientific developments taking you to a new kind of world altogether? Now, to reach that point, let us understand how he evaluated literary criticism till the point of time that he came onto the scene. And he concluded that earlier literary criticism, or literary criticism as practiced till then, was largely a very informal and a very haphazard kind of activity, which was very often very personal, very much biased, and always based on the critic's speculations and guesswork. So the critic or the reader had his or her own pet ideas, beliefs, and so on. And it is in that light that literary criticism was done. Of course, they gave a lot of importance to the personality of the author and the author's background and life and so on. But here you have new critics emerging who believe that, that is taking away the quality of the literary work itself. And they insisted on attaching more and more importance to the work itself rather than the poet or the poet's mind or the poet's influences or the poet's inspiration or anything. Attach importance to the work itself. And as a person who was also deeply interested in psychology, I. Richards was also interested in looking at the way in which poetry affects the mind. The way the composition comes from the mind, what happens in the mind of the poet when it is composed, but it doesn't stop there. How does the reader perceive it? How does that poet affect the reader's mind? These are some of the questions that he asked. And he believed that the mind is nothing but a set of impulses, which are reactions produced by some stimulus and ending in an act. So when it is the composition of a poem, the mind, there are certain impulses which are produced in the mind by certain stimuli outside. It could be an event, it could be an object, it could be a person, something outside which creates a reaction in the mind. That is what is known as an impulse. And this impulse does not just stop there. It is carried forward into some kind of action. Somebody does something as a result of this reaction. Something happens in your mind. As a result of that, you take some action. The composition of a poem is one such action. It is the act that comes as a result of a reaction in the mind created by some external stimulus. Your impulse, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ your reaction കാരണം, the mind works in a particular manner. And the composition of a poem happens to be one such act. Let me see if somebody is trying to get into the class. No. Okay, and with regard to poetry, one may say that, that the action that comes when a poem is composed is a result of such stimulus. There would be naturally something unique about this. That is why the act is the writing of a poem. Otherwise, it could be walking, laughing, crying, anything, any action at all. But if it is the composition of a poem, then you may be sure that the impulse that is responsible for it is of a unique nature. There are certain moments when impulses respond to a stimulus in a very organized way, in such a way that the mind experiences something very unique. It is different from what the mind experiences when you see something else, when you hear something else, when you talk to someone else, and so on. So it is in these rare moments that you have the composition of poetry. Aparna P, our student?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So the poetry, when people like I.R. Richards and Eliot talk about poetry, they're generally talking about art in general. Any creative work, any work of art is nothing but a representation of such a unique moment. The action that comes as a result of the mind experiencing this kind of a unique moment. But they do not stop with that, that act or that moment of inspiration and the act that comes after it. They say that we cannot understand the working of the poet's mind only on the basis of the work of art. That is something that you cannot come to any conclusion regarding. There might be so many ways in which the mind would have responded to that. We can only look at the work of art and then respond to it in our own way. It is on that basis that we can say something about the work of art. And there, the way that work of art or the poem communicates, that is very important. It is not just the creation of the poem that is important, how it communicates. So some impulse, then the action, which is the creation of the poem, and then the way it communicates. So this is what they are more interested in, that poem itself and the way it communicates to the reader. It is not part of the poet's work to communicate that unique experience. The poet does not do it in order to communicate. The fact that it communicates is a different matter altogether. ഇത് ചെയ്യാൻ വേണ്ടിയല്ല പോയിറ്റിന്റെ ഉദ്ദേശം. You need not consider that as the poet's intention. Let me now communicate it to the audience and therefore I will write a poem. No, it may have happened very naturally on the part of the poet. The poet is moved or inspired enough to write, to compose, to paint a picture, to create a piece of sculpture and so on. But the poem is something that may satisfy the poet personally. The fact that others are reading it or watching that painting, studying it, looking at that sculpture and making assessments about it, that is actually not the poet's concern. Other, വേറൊരു activity. It happens beyond the poet. And this, therefore, does not mean that the poem does not communicate to the readers. It does communicate. Any act, for that matter, basically fulfills the task of communicating. It does communicate to the reader. And if the poem, you think, fails to communicate to the readers, then actually we can conclude that the experience has not been accurately embodied in the work. Each experience of mankind has a communicative form. You may be conscious or unconscious of it, but every act of yours communicates something to someone else. It may be a creative act, it may not be a creative act, but every act that you perform communicates something to the others. And poetry being a creative art, that also communicates something. The poet may or may not be conscious about it, but the fact remains that the poem or the work of art communicates to the audience. And communication thereby is something that is inseparable from poetic experience. The poet may or may not have intended it, but it does communicate. And that whole poetic experience, which is complete only by taking into consideration the readers too, leads us to the conclusion that communication is inseparable from poetic experience. Yeah, so that's an important statement that I. Richards makes, to explain which, how does a work of art communicate? You need to understand the kind of language that an artist uses, a poet, a painter, a filmmaker, and so on. They use language in a different way. To understand their unique use of the language, we need to broadly categorize the use of language into two groups. Language, any language, it may be the language of poetry, it may be the language of painting, any language, any activity. Language by and large is used in two different ways. One is a very practical, direct use of language, which I. Richards calls the scientific use of language. He also calls it the referential use of language. Other critics of the same age, like Victor Shklovsky, for example, he calls it the practical use of language. Each critic had his own terminology for the scientific, referential, or practical use of language, which we may also call the denotative use of language. When words denote a meaning, when words refer to an object. This is using words for the sake of the references that they promote. And this is exactly the way in which scientific activity happens. When you're engaged in a scientific activity, and scientific activity does not mean anything that happens in the laboratory alone. Anything that happens in a practical, real situation, which has a very clear purpose. Like, for example, drinking water. You feel thirsty and that you drink water. When you say, I am drinking water, it does not mean anything beyond that. This is a situation which you may consider a scientific situation, where you have proof of the fact that you are drinking water because you are thirsty. It may be verified. There is nothing hidden here. Everything is clear. Everything may be verified. Everything may be accounted for. All such situations can be considered as scientific context. Okay? What you read in the newspaper can also be considered as a scientific context, because what happens there is information being communicated. A newspaper gives you information regarding an election, for example. This person won the election with a majority of 1,024 votes. It's very precise. There is no hidden meaning there. It is a very precise piece of information that is conveyed there. When the newspaper writes that this is what happened in the city, that there will be rainfall at 10 a.m. tomorrow, all of this is scientific language, where each word or the language, the words in that language, are a reference to a corresponding object in reality. I gave you the example of the tree. When I say tree, I refer to a proper tree. I. Richards uses the example of fire. He says, when I say fire in a scientific or referential manner, I refer to that thing, that thing which emanates, from which emanates heat and so on. Fire, in the nammal parayunna aa karyam. Someone trying to enter the meeting. Yeah. On the other hand, there are many other situations where you cannot manage with this kind of language alone. This practical, very direct, referential or scientific use of language may not suit our purpose, especially when you want to convey a particular mood, a particular emotion, a particular attitude, and so on. For that, you need to use language in a different way. So using words for the sake of the attitudes and the emotions, that is what is known as the emotive use of language. This is how language is used in art. Instead of referring to an object, the word evokes an emotion. In a film, for example, we were discussing a movie called Battleship Potemkin the other day, where you have the Khadija, she does not belong to our class, right?
No, ma'am.
Allalo?
Allah, ma'am.
Yeah, so there you have, the filmmaker trying to convey the idea of a revolution. It's not very easy to convey that, the people, the idea of a revolt rising in the people. And he uses a technique in order to do that. You have the image of three lions. The first one is a lion, the statue of three lions. First one is a sleeping lion. The second one is a lion that is alert. The third one is a lion that stands up on its four. So he uses these three images. They have no relevance at all to that context in a real situation. It is happening in the sea. You have no lions there. You have no lion statues there. But by using these three shots there of the three statues of the lions in different poses, the filmmaker communicates the idea of a people in whom the idea of revolution has awoken, has risen, very much like this lion which is now standing up. So that is how the language of art works. It works in a different way, and you cannot refer and you cannot verify it unlike you do it in the scientific context. You cannot ask, how did the lion come? In the parnura, verification is not possible here. In this context, the word fire, for example, refers to spirit, passion, excitement, so many other things, which may not be actually communicated properly in verbs. So scientific language can be verified by reference to the original. When you say somebody is dressed in black, you can verify it. Has that person worn black? No, that person is wearing a red dress. So you can say, no, that is wrong. If it is in black clothes that that person is dressed, yes, right. Whereas when you say somebody is dressed in black in an emotive context, you mean that that person is mourning. The color black does not have any relevance. You want to convey the idea that he or she is sad, there is some death, and that it is that which cannot be conveyed through words. So a poet uses this indirect way of evoking a mood or idea or attitude, neither caring for the literal meaning of the words nor for their logical sequence. That is all what poetry is about. Poetry can never be presented in a logical manner. You cannot verify the reality or the credibility of what is stated in poetry. You have what is called this willing suspension of disbelief, you have poetic license and so on. You have the classic case of a poem like Kubla Khan in Coleridge's Kubla Khan, where you have a sunlit dome made of ice. We know that a dome just cannot stand on, as a dome when you have the sun shining so brightly. A dome of ice with the sun shining high above would be an impossibility in reality. But that is the emotive use of language. It conveys something which normal scientific language cannot convey. So along with that, we also need to understand the four kinds of meaning. Now, this again does not refer only to the work of art, but in anything, it could be a political speech. You cannot consider it a work of art, but even in that, you need to take account of the fact that language can never be read in isolation. We need to understand the sense, the feeling, the tone, and the intention that is embedded in it. Here is Richards, the very close reader coming to the forefront. I. Richards and T.S. Eliot were people who popularized the art of close reading, looking at the language of the text, looking at the tone, the images, the metaphors, the style of the composition. There are people who attach a lot of importance to the form more than the theme. It is not the matter, the content, or the theme that is more important to them. What is more important is the language, the form, the manner in which something is said. So in that context, they attach a lot of importance to these four kinds of meaning: sense, feeling, tone, and intention. So I. Richards is absolutely certain about the fact that you can never arrive at a single universal meaning of something. It's a difficult task. It is almost an impossibility to arrive at a single universal meaning of anything. Thus, there are actually several kinds of meanings, and the total meaning is something that you can arrive at only by taking into consideration the sense, that is, what is said. What are the words? What are the items? What are the things that are used by the writer to say this? That is the sense. The feeling behind it, what is the attitude, the emotion, the interest, the will, the desire, etc., towards what is being said. Is it with sarcasm? Is it with sorrow? Is it with joy? Is it with excitement? What is the feeling that is embedded in this text, in this poem, in this painting? Is something you need to ask. Then the tone. What is the tone that the writer uses? What is the tone that the audience or the reader hears or reads or perceives? And finally, the intention. What the writer's conscious or unconscious aim may have been in writing this, in composing this work of art. So these are the four kinds of meaning: sense, feeling, tone, and intention. Without taking these four into consideration, you cannot arrive at a proper understanding of a work of art, according to I. Richards. And finally, as part of his statement on the value of poetry, he believes that poetry indeed has a great deal of value, even in today's age of scientific advancement. We need to understand that poetry speaks not to the mind, but to the impulses. It is not speaking to the mind and informing you, teaching you, or conveying information to you. It is speaking to another realm altogether, and those are called the impulses. Poetry's speech, literal or unliteral, logical or illogical, is faithful to its experience to the extent to which it induces a similar experience in others. The poet or the creator experiences something, uses a medium to convey that experience. It is not based only on that experience. All that you have gained so far, all that you are, all your feeling will also be embedded in that. And it is that totality which communicates to the reader. So that whole process is important. And these impulses, the impulses that go into the composition of the poem and the reading of the poem. He says impulses, as a psychologist, he categorizes impulses into two kinds: the appetencies and the aversions. These are the words that he uses. They just mean desires and dislikes. Aversions are things that you do not like, the dislikes. Appetencies are that which you have an appetite for, that is, that which you like or desire. And the mind instinctively prefers the satisfaction of desires, not of dislikes. That is how we are all wired. We would like to do only that which we like to do, that which creates an elevating effect on us. It is the satisfaction of desires that human beings, any living thing is wired to cater to. It is only in a very, what shall you say, perverse condition that you would want to satisfy your dislikes. Otherwise, we always try to satisfy our desires. It prefers that which is elevating rather than that which is depraving, gaining something. Therefore, when the poet organizes his or her impulses, creating that work of art, it is something that is good for the poet. Okay, the poet is doing it as an act which satisfies his or her desires. അല്ലാതെ ദേഷ്യം തീർക്കാനോ ഇഷ്ടമില്ലാത്ത കാര്യം പറയാൻ വേണ്ടിയല്ല. The poet is doing it to satisfy that desire. I want to write this. I love that, and therefore I want to write about it. It is always elevating. It is always that satisfies the desires in the poet's mind. And what is good for the poet, therefore, when it is given to the society and when the people of that society read it, naturally, they will also be reading it in a way that satisfies their desires. Ultimately, therefore, you may say that the poem or the work of art is something that gives something elevating, something good to the society. That is the way in which he argues that poetry has great value in this world. Even in this age of scientific enlightenment, poetry has a vital role to play in the life of the individual. The individual there may be the poet, the reader, and composed of all these individuals, the society too. In the mind ordered in the poetic way lies the hope of civilization. When these impulses are expressed and communicated using the poetic way of language, poetic use of language, then it has an elevating effect upon the civilization, upon the society. And that is the value of poetry. Okay? It may be, it's not as if the poet will only write about good things. The poet may be writing about sad things. The poet may write about death. A painter may capture an image of pain, of suffering. But it is conveyed in such a way that it has an elevating effect upon it, a kind of sublime effect. It takes you to a different realm altogether. You gain insights into pain, suffering, and death, which you would never gain if you were reading about it only in a scientific way, because that will look only at certain aspects of it. It may be able to communicate the real pain. It may be able to communicate the physical pain. But what that pain can transform you into, what that experience can transform you into, is something that can be conveyed only when the poetic use of language is employed. So in the mind ordered in the poetic way lies the hope of civilization. That is what can have that transforming effect on civilization, according to I. Richards. So that is the great value of poetry. And he concludes with the observation that poetry has, in fact, a therapeutic function. It can act like a panacea, a kind of medicine. It has a therapeutic function in society. It can coordinate a variety of human impulses into an aesthetic whole, a composition, helping both the writer and the reader maintain their psychological well-being. And he valued a poetry of inclusion that was able to contain the widest variety of warring tensions and oppositions. Even in the midst of any kind of pain and suffering, you can have poetry that elevates, and therefore the great value of poetry. So these are some of the observations that I. Richards makes, and the way in which he popularized the close reading of poems and highlighted the fact that when you read a poem, you need to do the maximum of justice to the language that is used in that poem. It is in this way that I. Richards influenced the field of literary criticism, in the way that he brought in this scientific spirit into literary criticism. We remember I. Richards as a very significant literary critic who gave the practice of literary criticism a new direction, who influenced later schools, and who have left, who therefore has left a very important stamp on the field of literary studies in general. We need not agree fully with I. Richards. We need not support his views, but we cannot deny the fact that Richards's practice as a literary critic did shape literary criticism. Whatever happened later happened also because of Richards's intervention. So that is what we need to remember regarding I. Richards and I. Richards as a critic. So I'll stop there for the moment and first of all stop the recording.